The trauma bay doors burst open at 2:47 a.m., and Admiral Frank Hutchins came in screaming before he even saw the gurney. "Get me a real surgeon. Now." His voice cracked off the tile walls, bouncing past the nurse's station, past the terrified med students pressed against the glass. His son Danny lay on the table, chest torn open by shrapnel from a car wreck that shouldn't have happened to a 19-year-old kid 3 weeks out of boot camp. Blood soaked through the white sheet in a spreading bloom, and the monitor above his head screamed numbers that made the room go cold. 96% oxygen. Falling. 89. Falling. Commander Nora Vance didn't flinch. She'd heard men scream before, in deserts, in helicopters, in field hospitals held together with duct tape and prayer, back when nobody knew her name, back when she was just the medic who wouldn't let anyone die on her watch. She stepped toward the gurney, gloved hands already moving, eyes locked on the wound. "Sir, I need you to step back," she said, calm as still water. "I asked for a surgeon, not a nurse," the Admiral roared, jabbing a finger toward her face, close enough that she could smell the coffee and fear on his breath. Behind him, a young resident named Dr. Patel opened his mouth to explain, then closed it again, because everyone in that room except the Admiral already knew who Nora Vance really was. They'd heard the whispers. 2 tours. A silver star nobody was supposed to talk about. Hands that had reopened chests in the back of blacked-out Black Hawks over provinces that don't appear on maps. "Sir, the surgeon on call is 20 minutes out," Nora said, not raising her voice, not backing down either. "Your son doesn't have 20 minutes. He has maybe 4. The monitor screeched. 82%. The Admiral's face went white, not with anger now, but with the raw terror of a father watching his child slip away in front of him, powerless in a way 30 years of command had never prepared him for. "Then do something," he shouted, and this time it wasn't a command, it was a plea, stripped of every stripe on his shoulder. Nora was already moving. "Patel, thoracotomy tray, now. Someone get me a rib spreader and clear this room." Her voice had changed, flattened into something clipped and precise, a voice built in triage tents where hesitation meant a body bag. The chaos of the room seemed to fold around her stillness. Nurses who had frozen a second earlier snapped into motion. The Admiral stumbled back against the wall, watching this woman he'd just humiliated pull on a second pair of gloves like she'd done this 1,000 times, because she had. "You're not authorized," he started, but Dr. Patel finally found his voice. "Sir, she's the most qualified person in this hospital for a penetrating chest trauma. Please, let her work." The Admiral looked at his son's gray face, at the blood pooling faster now, at the numbers dropping past 80, past 75, and something in him broke. He nodded, once, and pressed himself into the corner like a man watching his whole world balance on the edge of a scalpel. Nora made the incision between the 4th and 5th rib with a hand that didn't shake, cutting through muscle with the same economy of motion she'd used in a tent outside Kandahar when a 19-year-old corporal, not so different from the boy in front of her now, had been dying from a collapsed lung and no surgeon within 200 miles. The rib spreader clicked into place. Blood welled up dark and urgent. Danny's heart, when she finally saw it, was struggling, starved, beating in a stuttering rhythm that told her exactly how little time was left. "Internal massage," she said, and her hands moved into his chest cavity with a precision that made even the veteran nurses in the room hold their breath. Rhythmic. Controlled. Bringing life back into a heart that had almost given up. The monitor's scream softened into something steadier. 78. 81. 84. The Admiral slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, staring at the woman he'd called, not a real surgeon, watching her hold his son's heart in her bare hands and refuse to let it stop. If you're feeling the tension in this room right now, hit subscribe, because what happens next is going to change how you see every uniform in this story. 90%. The room exhaled as one. Nora didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the man crumbled against the wall, didn't need to. She had one job, and she was doing it the way she'd done it in places far darker than this trauma bay, places where rank meant nothing next to the simple, brutal math of a beating heart. Danny's fingers twitched. A good sign. The vitals climbed further, and for the first time since the doors had burst open, the Admiral allowed himself to believe his son might live, and that the woman he'd screamed at might be the only reason why. By the time the actual surgeon arrived, breathless and 30 seconds behind schedule, Danny Hutchins was stable enough to be wheeled toward the OR for the reconstructive work Nora's field intervention had bought him time to survive. The surgeon took one look at the precise, controlled incision, the perfectly managed internal massage, the steady vitals on the monitor, and said only one thing to the room: "Who did this?" Every nurse pointed to Nora, still gloved, still calm, wiping blood from her forearms like she was finishing an ordinary Tuesday shift. The Admiral hadn't moved from the corner. He sat on the floor of a trauma bay in his dress blues, a man who commanded thousands, reduced to silence by a woman he tried to dismiss with a single sentence. When he finally stood, his legs unsteady, he didn't say a word of apology. He just stared at her name badge, Commander Nora Vance, like the letters were rearranging themselves into something he should have recognized from the start. "Vance," he said slowly. "Nora Vance." Recognition crept across his face, pale and disbelieving. "You're the one from the Kandahar extraction. The one they wrote up in the classified briefing. I read that file. I thought," he stopped himself, shaking his head, because what he'd thought was that the woman in that file was a legend, an anonymous initials-only ghost story passed between officers over coffee, not a nurse standing in front of him in scrubs with his son's blood still on her hands. "I was a combat medic before I was a nurse, sir," Nora said, finally meeting his eyes without anger, without triumph, just tired honesty. "I've done this surgery in worse conditions than this. Your son is stable because someone in this room understood that sometimes the person with the least impressive title is the only one who can save a life." She peeled off her gloves, dropped them in the bin, and for the first time let herself look fully at the man who had screamed in her face 20 minutes earlier. "You didn't need a surgeon tonight, Admiral. You needed someone who wouldn't hesitate. That's not always the same thing." The Admiral's composure, forged over 3 decades of command, finally cracked completely. Not into anger this time, but into something rawer. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words seemed foreign in his mouth, unpracticed. "I've spent my whole career learning to read a room, read a threat, read a man's rank in half a second. I looked at you and saw scrubs instead of a soldier. That's on me. That'll always be on me." Behind him, Dr. Patel quietly filled in the pieces the Admiral didn't yet know: 2 tours, a Silver Star classified for reasons above most people's clearance, and a decision 3 years ago to leave a battlefield behind for a hospital where she thought she could still save people without losing them to politics and paperwork. Danny woke up 2 days later in the ICU, groggy, disoriented, and the first face he saw wasn't his father's. It was Nora's, checking his vitals with the same steady hands that had held his heart together when it mattered most. "They tell me you yelled at the woman who saved my life," Danny rasped, voice hoarse from the ventilator tube. His father, sitting bedside in a wrinkled uniform he hadn't changed out of, could only nod, jaw tight. "Yeah," the Admiral admitted. "I did." "Good thing she's better than you at admitting when she's wrong too," Danny managed. And even Nora allowed herself the smallest smile at that, because sometimes the truth needs a little humor to land. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened in that trauma bay spread through the hospital and then beyond it, how a combat nurse with a classified service record had reopened a dying man's chest with her bare hands while an admiral screamed insults 6 inches from her face, and how that same admiral had personally recommended her for a commendation once he learned exactly who he'd been shouting at. Nora didn't need the recognition. She'd spent years being underestimated by men who judged competence by rank instead of results, and she'd learned long ago that the work spoke louder than any apology ever could. But there was something quietly satisfying in watching Frank Hutchins salute her in the hallway 3 weeks later, formal and genuine, the same hand that had once pointed accusingly in her face now extended for a handshake instead. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing past what I said to you." Nora shook his hand and nodded, already turning back toward her next patient, because that's what she did, not for gratitude, not for recognition, but because somewhere in a hallway or a trauma bay, someone always needed a person who wouldn't hesitate.